Good morning everyone and welcome to the Ultimate Cloud series brought to you by AvePoint and the European SharePoint community. My name is Declan and I'm delighted to be joined today by Robb, who will be talking to you about challenges in building out a hybrid on-prem Office 365 solution. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter using the hashtag UltimateCloud. After the webinar we will have questions. Type any questions you have for Ben in the question pane in the control panel. Some questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass over to our webinar presenter, Robb. Hello Ben.
Hello Declan, and hello everyone, and thank you very much for spending the time to come to this webinar. Very pleased to present this. Let me just get my screen sorted out. So hopefully my screen should be showing now, and I'll get going. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is really what are the kind of challenges you're going to face in building out an environment that's going to support on-prem and Office 365 deployments, and really talk through some of the challenges that you're going to face as you get through that. So just a bit about me. I'm Robb. I'm an 8-time MVP for SharePoint. So I've been in the SharePoint game for a pretty long time. I started off doing Microsoft Content Management Server. In fact, before Microsoft bought MCMS, a company called Encompass, working with them in the late 90s. And then, as Microsoft built up their expertise and their product set around the collaboration and content management space, I've spent a lot of time in that field over the years through the different versions. Right now, I'm a senior manager at one of the big 4 consultancy professional services firms, mainly working on their global internal deployments. And some of the lessons I'm learning as I'm helping that organization build out their global 365 and on-prem SharePoint deployments. Hopefully I'll be able to share some of those insights as we go through this presentation. I'm also co-host of the London SharePoint User Group, which is part of the wider SharePoint User Group UK network. If you are in the UK and you haven't been to any SUG UK meetings, I'd highly recommend them. Regardless of where you are, there will be a reasonably local user group that you can go to, and there's a good broad mix of presentations that get delivered in that user group setting. So you should be able to find something, whether you're a developer or an IT pro, or you're from the business side, or an architect or a project manager. You should be able to find content from one of the sessions that's relevant to you. So just a bit about this session. It's really about some of the challenges that you're going to face. And just a disclaimer, I'm not going to be doing coding. It's not a developer session. I'm not going to be doing live demos. Really, it's about setting the context and giving you an idea of all the things you have to think about as you approach rolling out a hybrid environment. Because there are some very key differences to think about as you approach this that are not apparent if you're just going on-prem or just going to 365 in one go. So there's some technical challenges and there's some non-technical challenges, and like many projects, you're going to find there's some common themes, but there are definitely some nuances that are relevant to you as an audience, as an architect or a project manager or a decision maker going down the path towards a 365 on-prem hybrid. So I thought I'd start with setting the scene as to why you might actually need a hybrid environment in the first place. And there are lots of reasons. Every organization will have different reasons for moving in this way. But broadly, I've found 3 different drivers for this. The first is around the fact that you have potentially a very large legacy deployment. So if there's been a business decision at the CIO level, we're going to the cloud, get me a plan to move there. That's great, and all new content might easily move to the cloud. But what happens to the legacy information that you already have in your systems? How do you get that that data up to the cloud and get to a position where you can switch off your existing on-prem deployment? Now, there will be some period of time where you're going to be in transition. So you might have very large content sizes. In my organization, we have tens, if not hundreds, of terabytes in on-prem SharePoint deployments. And that's a significant challenge just from the physics perspective as to how to move that data up into a cloud environment. There's also change management overheads. There are some features in Office 365 that are different. There are certainly, if you've heavily invested in on-prem in earlier versions of SharePoint, so 2010 and earlier, you'll have potentially very large amounts of legacy code, legacy applications that will need to be reworked, maybe re-architected as you move into 365. So having a large legacy deployment is definitely a driver towards, at least initially, having a hybrid deployment. The second will really depend on the environment that you're operating in as a business. If you're in a highly regulated industry, my industry is pretty highly regulated, how do you then move from a position where you've locked all your data in your own data centers, it's all very securely managed, how do you then move into a public cloud environment? And there will be many industries that will have reservations about moving into that environment. So if you're in the pharmaceutical industry, if you're in the finance industry, if you're in law or accountancy or insurance, those are examples of tightly regulated environments. Those are, there will be some significant regulatory hurdles that you'll need to overcome. And even if you're not in that situation, you might well have data residency concerns. So data about your clients may not be able to leave your country. If you work in government services, you may not be able to move your data up to a cloud environment, or all of your data up to a cloud environment. So, for example, Germany or France, you don't have the option to host in Office 365 data within your country. You can keep it within the EU, but you can't move it up to 365 in France or Germany at the moment. So there are all sorts of concerns around that are important. In addition to that, you might well have regulations around content lifecycle. You might have retention policies that you need to maintain your data for 7 years or 15 years, depending on the country that you're in. And you may not want to move all of your legacy records up to an Office 365 in one go. So that's an example where you might want to retain maybe an archive, not very highly used, not the main portal that your users, as you're working through, your users will use day to day, but still retain that on-prem footprint for SharePoint. And then there's also, risk and privacy, and leaders may not feel happy going all into 365 in one go. So they may not want to bet the entire firm on a cloud service. So there may be some resistance there. And then there are some functional limitations. So some workloads are not fully supported in Office 365 yet, or are partially supported, or have different elements that work or don't work. So for example, business intelligence is a good case for that. In Office 365 you have the Power BI suite, which is moving ahead of the on-prem world, and in addition with the Office Graph and Delve capabilities that are coming to bear in the near future, that's only going to get more disparate between the on-prem and the 365 world. But you may well have built significant infrastructure internally to deal with specific workloads. So you might have invested heavily in performance points or something like that, or you're making heavy use of the publishing frameworks in SharePoint on-prem. Not all of those capabilities map 100% over to 365. So there may well be some specific workloads, some specific applications that you don't want to or can't move up to 365 yet. So all of these are really drivers for you coming to the table with a suggestion of we might need a hybrid environment. And from that, you're probably going to pick one of these three models. So the first model is around gradual migration. I know I have an ambition at some point to be 100% in Office 365, but it's going to take me some time to get there. I'm going to have to recode some stuff. I'm going to have to physically move all that content up there. I'm going to have to institute governance and policies to mean that I'm not ending up with unlimited sprawl in my Office 365 world. And I want to really resolve those over a period of time. So I might have an ambition that by 2018 or 2020, I'll be 100% in the cloud, but it's going to take me some time to get there. The second model is I'm always going to be hybrid, and unless the law fundamentally changes in my industry, unless the regulations and the compliance issues are fundamentally changed in the next 5 years, I'm going to have to retain some degree of on-prem footprint moving forward. So I need a solution that's going to enable me to always be hybrid. And then the final thing is I'm going to move entire workloads up to 365, like collaboration, like maybe some BI capabilities, but there'll be other capabilities that I don't want to move up to the cloud. I might have some specific applications that line of business applications that I've built. That's always going to be on-prem. I might have some requirements that have particular on-prem features. So moving on to the kind of technology challenges that you're going to face, there are really 6 main ones that are apparent. Those 6 are, we have search, so how you're going to implement your search infrastructure; user profiles, so how are you going to manage the process of maintaining a consistent user profile between different tenants, so your on-prem and your 365 worlds. How are you going to deal with social? And I'll talk a bit about how social, the out-of-the-box SharePoint social features are not helpful in a hybrid world, and some of the ways that you can move around that. And then to also talk a bit about how you're going to do application lifecycle management, how your operations are going to have to change, as you move into a hybrid world, and what your upgrade story is going to be. So, tackling search first. Search is really one of the key service applications that drives pretty much all of the capabilities of SharePoint, both on-prem and in the cloud. So effectively, there are 3 different models for hybrid deployments. You're going to have to make a decision as to which of those is appropriate to your business case, your use cases as you deploy that. And the 3 different options are: you can have search that is provisioned so that search is isolated within each environment, so there's no global search. You can have search where on-prem on-prem content can be crawled and surfaced within Office 365, and you can have the reverse of that as well. So those three main topologies really will drive the user experience, and you need to think carefully about what you want that end user experience to be, and how you need the on-prem content to be secured. So if you don't have a problem, so if you're going for a gradual migration, pretty much everything is going to go up to 365 at some point. It's just going to take you time to get there. You probably want to configure search so that it's running in, the search experience is run by Office 365, and then you're augmenting the search results from Office 365 with content that's stored in the on-prem world. There's very, very good guidance on MSDN and TechNet on all of those different approaches, different topologies. There's entire white papers that we could spend the entire hour talking about. If you do need to have search working in both locations, for example, you've got some content that you really can't move between the environments. It's very important to make sure that your search configurations between Office 365 and SharePoint are the same. So you've got to make sure your managed properties, your crawled properties, all of those configuration settings are the same between the different environments, because otherwise you're going to get different experiences and different results depending on where the content is. So really the answer, as with many of these recommendations, are you've got to make sure that your configuration is done through PowerShell and is automated as far as possible. So you're not relying on some human being to make sure that those two sets of configuration are in sync. The other sort of side point to this is, if you're using metadata, you must make sure that your managed metadata service is also synchronized between on-prem and 365. So you've got to decide, where is your master source of taxonomy. If it's on-prem, it can be in either location. It doesn't really matter. But what you then need to do is have a business process within your organization to take the MMS fields not the MMS fields, the MMS term store from your master source, whether that's SharePoint or 365, and push that out to the other one, so that you keep those GUIDs in sync, because search and the rest of SharePoint will use the term GUIDs, not the labels on those terms, to actually do the mapping back to your taxonomy. So if you don't keep those in sync, what you'll find is that searches with metadata filters or metadata filters in the search will return multiple values with the same term label, because as far as search is concerned, if they have different GUIDs, different IDs, they're gonna be considered as different terms. So taxonomy, very important to move those between them. There are no out-of-the-box tools to enable you to do this. You can export the entire MMS store and then import that. But the problem with that is you then lose any user-generated content that's also stored in the term store. And if there were any other differences, you might have a global taxonomy and then a specific taxonomy for a particular application on Prem. You would lose that if you did the all-in migration. So the APIs exist. You can extract the term ID, the terms as an XML file, and then import that, retaining the IDs. So the second sort of major technical hurdle you're going to have is around user profile and single sign-on. And really, I'm sort of going to assume that you're going to have an Active Directory implementation in your organization. You're going to be able to set up AD Sync in Azure to provide the Active Directory and the user account creation. But just a word of warning: if you've got a very complex, maybe a multi-forest or multi-domain environment, you might want to look at cleaning that up and making sure you really understand the structures, and that those Active Directory forests are pretty clean before you do your sync, because you're going to have challenges with your AD Sync if you don't. You've also then got to think about some of the other things that you are doing with user profiles. So do I need to keep user profile properties in sync between on-prem and 365? If you do, I would strongly recommend that you make use of the FIM, the Forefront Identity Manager, to manage the overall synchronization of your identities. So there's some guidance again on TechNet to how to manage that process and move that forward. And effectively, what you're doing is you're saying, I'm going to be able to seed my user profile fields from maybe an HR system or an ERP system, and I can seed both my on-prem and my 365 data with the same data stores with the same authoritative data. So that's very good for authoritative data that's going to be read-only in SharePoint, but you might want to use to drive personalization or audiences. For user-generated data, so information that you want people to be able to change and set about themselves as a profile, there's not really a good hybrid story there. You're going to have to make a decision. Do I want that data in Office 365, or do I want that data on-prem? And if you do need that synchronized, again, you're going to have to write code to manually synchronize that data to the end product. So you've definitely got to think about what custom properties am I going to have, and how do I expose that so that it's accessible in both on-prem and 365. And really understand what's the authoritative data that's going to be read-only, and what's the data that end users you want end users to be able to change. So that sort of segues nicely into social. And from a social perspective, what you've really got to understand is where is the social data kept, and how do I make sure that that's synchronized between the two? Because if you think about it, the social stuff out of the box, so the follow stuff, where's your my site, where's the stuff to do with the not just follow, but the commentary, the ratings, and so on. All of that's kept in the social DB in your user profile store. So, given you've really got to make sure that, given you have a situation where you're never going to be able to have a single location where all of that data is available, because some of your content is going to be in the cloud and some of it's going to be on-prem, it's going to be very difficult to get a single view of all the stuff I'm following or all the comments I've made. So all those features that you see in my sites in the Office 365 world, you're only going to have a subset of that data moving forward. So the advice here is, leverage the changes that happened in SP1 in the on-prem world. Start using Yammer and OneDrive for Business to really drive those features, and if possible, switch off those social features in one or both of the environments. And it's quite tricky to switch off, particularly follow, everywhere. So you do need to track down all the. There's a couple of features that you can disable, but then there's some places where it still crops up, like search results and some other places. So there is a piece of work to be done to actually track down all those locations where it's available. Because what you're trying to avoid is a situation where you're going to give a confusing message to your end users, where you've got an environment where people don't really understand why they're not seeing certain bits of data or certain things, where it's not very predictable for your users. So those are the sort of main features that you really need to worry about in a hybrid world. I think most of the other service apps and sort of big functional blocks, they're really self-contained, down to individual applications or web applications or site collections. So the other service applications are less worrying than those sort of global shared applications like social profiles and search and taxonomy, I guess. So some of the other things you're going to have to think about from a technology perspective around application lifecycle management and operations. So how do you actually manage the fact that you've got multiple environments? And there's some challenges you're going to have, particularly with the Office 365 world, if you've been used to setting up your environments as a formal multi-tier, multi-server deployments where you've got dev servers, dev int servers, automated build servers through QA staging and production. That whole paradigm shifts when you move to Office 365, and what you'll find is that you need to reevaluate the way that you do application lifecycle management. And there's some reasons for that. The first is it's quite difficult to set up a test tenant because you can only do an AD sync to a single tenant. So you can't really say, well, I'm going to deploy my customizations or examine what's going on with a full replica of production. There's no real way of doing that. So at the least, you're going to have to set up if you don't have already, a testing Active Directory domain that you can use to sync up to a test tenant in order to do those tests. So given those complexities and the value add from doing that, really you're left with having to use a test site collection to deploy to. So and do your sort of final validations and final testing on that. So it's really in the production environment, in the production tenant, but it's not something that your end users are using day to day. And because of the app model, because of the way that you can abstract away the customizations from SharePoint, you should be able to deploy that just into a test site collection and do the majority of the testing there. But it is important to invest in test and deployment automation. So as you're thinking about, how do you validate that stuff's working, you don't want to have to spend days doing manual tests. You don't want to have to make it difficult or something you need to do on every site collection. You need to invest in the automated deployment techniques for that. And then you need to think about, how do I have a unified process where common features, common solutions that have to be deployed to both on-prem and 365, how do they get there? And how do I make it so that they get to Office 365 and my on-prem production deployments at the same time? So really you've got to look at your existing processes. You've got to look at where it needs to branch, and you need to make sure that you're able to deploy the solutions successfully to both locations. And where possible, make sure that you've got a common code base between the two. So as you're architecting solutions, make sure that you're thinking, well, is there a common core that I can strip out into a separate deployable unit that can be deployed to both locations, thereby minimizing the differences between the two, having very small, lightweight components that are different potentially between on-prem and 365. Also think about upgrade cycles. So obviously the upgrade cadence for on-prem is roughly every 2.5 to 3 years, whereas on Office 365 they're releasing new capabilities and new features into 365 every 10 days. So on-prem and 365 already have different capabilities. They are diverging quite rapidly, and they'll come back together again, but for the time being, they're pretty far apart in terms of capabilities. So what you need to think about is, what's the impact of that to the user experience? How do I make sure that I don't have customizations being broken because it works in on-prem and it worked last week in 365, but it's now not working? And how do I mitigate that risk? So how do I set up processes where I'm doing daily tests of my Office 365 environment so that I can catch when things break, when they break, rather than when users start ringing me up? And I guess you're also going to have to make sure you're communicating effectively with your stakeholders and your users to say, this is the impact of getting all these new features faster. We need to be aware that there may be things that break in a short time frame. And what that means is you're going to have to align your internal release cycles to that whole process. So you've got to make sure that you're you're able to release not on maybe your existing deployment processes might take 3 months, or your project cycles might take 3 months, that's not going to be good enough if you need to rapidly respond to things that are breaking in your Office 365 world. And then how do you then align that back to your on-prem deployments? So do you make sure that you align that completely so you get to a position where you can deploy new capabilities and new bug fixes and things to your to your on-prem world at the same speed that you can to your Office 365 world? So there's a lot to think about in terms of application lifecycle management and upgrade, and that impacts your operational effectiveness as well. So you've got to make sure you really understand the impact of Office 365 on your operations. So how do you do backups and BCP implementation? So what is the plan there? And particularly where you've got a hybrid solution where some data or some processes may live on-prem and some in the cloud, there's lots of moving parts, lots of things that can break. How do you make sure that you're aware of those and understand the impact of one of those components breaking at any given time? And really that comes down to best practice around operational effectiveness. How are you managing your monitoring? Who's getting alerted? I referred earlier to making sure that that monitoring isn't just traditional SCOM type monitoring of on-prem. It's not just traditional, is my server up? Is my site up? It's also actually running automated tests on a regular basis, like every day or multiple times a day, to make sure that you really understand when things start breaking. So those are predominantly technology or IT-based challenges, but a lot of the challenges you're going to face are also relevant to how your business works. So they're to do with how you're going to train your users, what's the user experience, how you're going to deal with support, and how that interfaces with Microsoft's support engine. How you're going to do content lifecycle management, and is there a process for doing that? So starting off with the user experience, I think you may have very good reasons to go for a hybrid environment, but if you're going for a gradual migration, or there's some compliance reasons why you can't move certain data up to 365, that's really a business decision as to how fast or whether you can move that data. So from an end user's perspective, they don't care. They want to do something. They want to perform a task. They want to collaborate with people. They want to upload documents. They want to share information. They want to search for information. They really don't care whether that data is in the cloud or on your on-prem servers. And so really what you should be trying to do is make that experience seamless. So it looks maybe not identical, but similar. It looks, it behaves in very similar ways, so that capabilities, where possible, are equivalent between the on-prem and 365. And the processes you go through to do certain tasks. So how do you upload a document? How do you search for information? How do you create a site? All of those processes should be unified and consistent between the environments, because the end user just wants to get the job done. They don't really understand. They shouldn't really need to know whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. The one caveat to that is it is important to clearly identify with maybe a branding switch, so maybe slightly different colors, or maybe a slightly different logo or something like that, which will clearly identify to the users which host you're on. And that's important for two reasons. The first is if there are compliance reasons or business policy which says certain data can't live in the cloud, you need to be telling people you're in the cloud, so that training you had or that communication you had to not put certain bits of data in here, they need that visual clue to make sure that they get that. And then secondly, as you're trying to get support to troubleshoot issues, they need to know very easily whether you're on-prem or 365. And I'll get on to that now. So you really, as you move through support, you've got to understand how your own internal support team interface with 365 support team, because Microsoft don't let any member of an organization who's signed up to 365 call them up. So it has to go through a smaller number of people from your support organization. So there's obviously some work on process that you need to do there, and that's definitely going to be aided by knowing when an issue comes in, is that an internal on-prem issue or a 365 issue. But also you've got to give your support staff training on what the differences are between those environments and what the expectation is for response. So you might have some SLEs defined for your response times on-prem deployments, which simply can't be met by Office 365, and the contracts will state what that response time is. So that it's important for your support team to understand that there will be a difference between I've got an issue, a server's down, I ring up a particular team and they will go and fix that server. That's going to be a different response time compared to if you're in the this is an Office 365 issue and raising a support call with them. So that's important to set those expectations early. And then as you're setting those expectations with the support team, you've also got to make sure that your stakeholders and all of your users are also aware of those as well. So really there's a lot of training and communication requirements for deploying in a hybrid world. So you've got to make sure you're communicating what the end goal is, whether it's a gradual migration and everyone's going to get to 365 eventually, or it's not. It's a always hybrid, forever hybrid world. People have really got to understand what that is, what that end goal is, and how you're planning to get there. So communication is really important. You've also got to make sure your staff are aware of what benefits they're going to get. So talk to them about Office Graph and Delve. Talk to them about the fact that content that's in the on-prem world won't benefit from Office Graph. And set their expectations on when and how they're going to be migrated. How you're going to do site provisioning really depends on how you're doing it right now. You might be using a third-party tool. You might have built your own workflows to manage site provisioning, or you might, a smaller organization might just do it through an email request to an owner of the environment or a support desk ticket or something like that. There are a couple of sort of key points that you want to make sure that you're covering from a business perspective, though. You've got to make it very easy for people to create sites, because if you don't, they'll start using other technologies. If you put any barriers up to site creation, it's going to be, people will start using other systems. Make sure that so give them a simple form, a single form to fill in, and couch it in language that really uncovers the business requirements of the site, and don't get the users to specify whether it's a 365 or an on-prem site. Now, that should really be some kind of central decision. It's either an automated decision through some business rules, or it might be an individual making that decision that it goes on-prem versus 365. It depends on what those rules are and how easy they are to automate. There's a lot of good guidance just been released by the Patterns and Practices team from Office 365 around a new way of provisioning sites that allows for a hybrid model, and I'd definitely recommend going and reading that. It moves away from the traditional site template model and moves more towards a scripted, consistent model where you just use one of these standard templates like team site, and then use scripts. They use PowerShell scripts to switch on features or switch off features. And the beauty of that is it works both on-prem and 365, doesn't require any deployment to either the on-prem or the 365 world, and it can be changed without deploying new versions. And also allows you to really tightly define the order in which things get switched on. So one of the challenges with site templates is you weren't always sure of the order in which events would fire. So that sometimes led to race conditions where you might have a feature that assumed that maybe a list had already been created through another feature, but because that list was still being created, that feature activation failed. So you can avoid all of those kind of complexities by moving to this new model that Patterns and Practices are working on. I would strongly recommend looking at that. Content lifecycle, where does your content live long term, particularly records? And understand that you might need to think about how content moves between environments. So you might have a site that starts off in 365, and then maybe you realize that there's going to be some content that can't live in that environment. So you need a way of being able to move it from 365 to on-prem, and vice versa. You might have a policy which says all our internal collaboration happens on-prem, but our client extranet happens in the 365 world. You might have a project which starts, or a team site that starts on-prem, but then you suddenly realize you actually need to collaborate with third parties or clients or whatever, so you want to move it up to 365. There are vendors in this space that can help. So AppPoint, who are sponsoring this, an example of a vendor that that can help with this requirement. AppPoint also have a big governance suite that that we're using internally as well. So managing how to manage the policies in a more robust manner across all of our SharePoint estate. And then legal constraints, as I've referred to earlier. There's going to be legal requirements that you're going to have to deal with, particularly around e-discovery. And so you've got to think about, well, how do I maintain my e-discovery process when I'm having to search both on-prem and 365? Are there any differences in the way I do holds or gather the information for a disposition? So I would strongly recommend, as you start thinking about this, you engage with your legal department as soon as possible, because they're going to be quite key stakeholders in understanding exactly how you're going to implement some of these things. So I just thought I'd finish for the last couple of minutes talking about, if you're doing a big migration, and most hybrid deployments will require some degree of migration, I've got a few tips on how to manage that. The first thing you need to do really is to be able to classify and classify the sites that you need to move and understand the scale of the problem that you've got. And really that's going to drive how you then communicate back to leadership about how fast you can move your 360. You can move your sites up to 365. So I talked about earlier, a gradual migration might take 3 years, or it might take 5 years, or it might take a year. And really, you don't know the answer to that. You don't know the length of time that you're going to have to allocate to that until you think about, this kind of approach of classifying your sites. So the first thing you need to do is really understand how many of your sites are just standard out-of-the-box team sites and other utility sites that there's really been very little customization outside the sort of maybe the branding and the core centralized sites that you have. How many of those are utility sites versus someone's gone to town with SharePoint Designer, or they've used a lot of BI or BCS, or some of the more complex requirements. And you need to be able to filter those down, because what you'll find is those utility sites are going to be relatively straightforward. There's going to be a lot of them, but they're going to be relatively straightforward to migrate. Those custom projects and the ones with BI and BCS, they're going to be much harder to migrate, and they're going to need a lot more hand-holding and so on as you migrate through. So what you'll find is the effort of those big sites of those custom sites is significantly more than the utility sites. So effectively what you need is a list of all your sites. You then need to filter down by the unused sites, and you can look at certain stats like when was the site last updated, when was there new content added to the site, when was it last accessed, that kind of thing. Also, are the site owners still working in your organization? You'd be surprised how many old sites just the people who set them up no longer even work in the company. So you need a process of filtering those unused sites, and that's going to involve communication strategies. So you definitely have to make sure you're talking to your site owners as you go through this process. And what you're trying to do is reduce the number of sites that you actually have to migrate down to the number that you really do, and have an archiving strategy to deal with everything else. So you're not wasting time migrating sites that no one uses. You definitely need a process for once you're actually in the migration process. You need to have a detailed communication strategy with them. And what you're trying to do is make sure that you have an open channel. And what we do is we have a standing meeting every day through our migration window, where we migrate a wave of sites for the week or the month or whatever, and we then have an open session in Yammer and through a link call where site owners can come to us and ask questions and raise issues and so on. And that we also have more formal feedback mechanisms, but that's really been the key thing to get that feedback from and that engagement from the site owners. They then through that process we're building a detailed FAQ so that future releases, future migrations, we understand. We can give that information up front to site owners, and they really get a much clearer idea about what's going to happen through the migration. And then also, as we improve the process that we use to migrate, obviously things that happened early on are no longer happening. So we're seeing a higher degree of failures, a lower number of failures. But you will have failures, even with the best process. You need to understand what's that cutover process look like. How do you roll back, and prepare management for the fact that you're, and your users for the fact that maybe 10 to 15% of your sites will fail first time. We've actually reduced that now to about 3%. So we're going, and then leaders like graphs, like charts, build reports on the status, the numbers, the process that you're going through. And as you go through that process, you want to be saying, we're ramping up the number of sites that we're moving week on week. We're seeing a 10 to 15 percent fall off in success, and those will then go back into the queue for migration. So it's a non-trivial task, because effectively what you're telling people is, we're moving all your content and your URL is going to change. So that's disruptive for a lot of people. So just to wrap up, there are lots of technical and non-technical complexity that get introduced as you're moving to a hybrid world, and thinking about some of those from a feature perspective, you've really got to think about search and user profile and taxonomy and social as a sort of big ticket items. You've got to think about how your internal IT processes are going to have to change, whether that's your operational monitoring, your deployment processes, your application lifecycle processes, how your support team are going to understand how to interface with Microsoft support, and what differences there are going to be as you start getting support tickets that need to understand, is this going down an Office 365 support route, or is this going down the on-prem support route? So that new triage process needs to be worked through. You need to think about the user experience, how you're going to have a consistent brand identity between the two environments so that you're not confusing people. You've got to think about how you're going to have a centralized process for creating and monitoring and then decommissioning sites between those environments. And then, are there any content lifecycle concerns that you need to think about moving content between the two environments? And then really, as you're migrating content up to 365, think about how you're going to report success, how you're going to report progress, and how you're going to alert leaders and sponsors and stakeholders in your organization to potential issues, because ultimately they're going to want to know when it's done. So hopefully that will have given you some insights into some of the challenges that you're going to face. And I guess we've got a couple of minutes for questions. So,
thank you, Ben, for a great presentation. Now just to deal with some questions. So first question, a few people have been asking, can we get the slides from the presentation? So we'll make the slides available in a mail later today. And another question, Ben. If a company mainly deals with large documents, such as an architect company, would this be a case to leave those on-premise? Or in other words, if they were continuously uploading, downloading to from Office 365, would there be bandwidth limitations and performance issues?
I guess it depends on a couple of things. I think, so the first thing I'd say is if you do have very large documents, actually Office 365 offers, or OneDrive for Business offers a better experience for that. So I'm thinking particularly that the the changes in upload size that have come through for so moving away from the 2 gig limit in Office 365. So if you've got very, very large files, that may be an option that actually works better on 365. And I guess the other thing is, where are your documents stored right now? If you've got a server room in your building and you've got SharePoint in that server room, you're probably that's obviously going to be a faster transfer than going to 365. But most organizations, even if they host on-prem SharePoint, they don't have SharePoint physically located in their building. They'll have rented some space in a managed provider, and in that case, it probably doesn't make much difference whether you're going to 365 or sort of on-prem, whether that's on-prem in your own data centers or some third-party data centers. In most cases, you're not going to be physically co-located with those with the SharePoint farm anyway. So I would definitely say that 365 in that space is probably going to have a higher bandwidth tolerance than pretty much any other provider, including your own data centers. So we've looked at this in our organization, and we're a global organization, so we have those kind of challenges even with our on-prem. People in Australia or worse in, say, sub-Saharan Africa, that is very challenging. But there are some things that you can do regardless of whether you're talking about on-prem or 365 to help that. So things like branch cache, things like being able to make use of the Office 2013 document shredding capabilities. Obviously that may not work for, say, CAD documents for an architect's practice, but in general, you're very unlikely to be downloading the whole document. And then just sort of again talking about Office documents in particular, in both Office 365 and on-prem, the need to download the whole document is reduced by being able to use Office web apps or Office Online. So being able to do that rather than downloading the entire document every time, that really helps with user adoption. We certainly found moving from 2010 to 2013, that's been a significant change for us.
Okay, thanks, Ben. I think we've time just to squeeze in one more question. So metadata sync is certainly important, and third-party tools exist for this purpose. What are your thoughts on maintaining content types in a hybrid environment?
There isn't a good answer to that. I mean, basically what you have to do is make sure that you're deploying them in the same way in both environments. So I'm thinking specifically about content types with managed metadata fields. What you'll need to do is make sure your metadata term store is the same between on-prem and 365, and importantly has the same GUIDs for term group, term store, term set. All of those GUIDs have to be the same. And then when you're provisioning your content types with those managed metadata fields, you need to have make sure that you're referencing those GUIDs successfully. So there's not a great answer for that. It is something you need to make sure that when you deploy to on-prem, you're deploying in the same way to 365.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. That's all the time we have for questions today. So thank you all again for joining us today for this webinar. And don't forget to join us October 21st for the final webinar in the Ultimate Cloud series, where Neil Hodgkinson will be talking about configuring hybrid workloads for SharePoint 2013 and Office 365. To register and find out more about this webinar, go to bit.ly/NeilH.
If you want to know more detail technically about particularly the search topologies, that presentation will cover all of that. Neil's the guy who wrote all the features for that.
Okie doke. And just a little bit about the organisers of today's webinar. So AvePoint are the established leader in enterprise class cloud, compliance, data governance and management software solutions for next generation social collaboration platforms. For information on AvePoint, go to www.avepoint.com. The European SharePoint Conference is the largest European event covering SharePoint and Office 365 technologies, and we have some big news coming soon regarding our 2015 dates and location. Make sure to keep tabs on the conference website, www.sharepointeurope.com, to stay up to date with the latest developments. Goodbye for now, and I hope to see you all soon.